I have a few announcements to start off. First of all, sympathy to the family of McKinley Matt Griffin, who is Trevor Griffin's father. His service will be Thursday, August 11th at Cheatham County Funeral Home in Ashland City. Also, Chastity Hall had scans this week, and we'll hear results on Friday. Pray that her tumors are shrinking. Also, Doug, Utley, and Fran are back in Centennial Hospital, unfortunately. Jeremy Petty broke his foot and will have surgery on Monday. I remember him. Willie Hamilton has had a stroke and has lost feeling on his left side. Betty Hall is now back at the Trace after being in the hospital for a few days. Jennifer Hillard is in Horizon with a bone infection. And Darlene Forrest is home after having back surgery, so there's some good news. Reminder, there will be a elders and deacons meeting at 3 p.m. this Sunday. Family night will be Monday, August 15th at 6:30. Reminder, Kids for Christ will have a fishing trip on August 20th. See the bulletin for details. And Churches of Christ Disaster Relief needs volunteers to pack boxes at their Allied Drive location on Tuesday, August 16th at 10 a.m. They will be sending 1,500 family boxes to Eastern Kentucky to help out there. So I'm sure if you can help out, that'd be great. All right, that's all the announcements for this evening. We'll start our service here, number 778 in your book, Whosoever Meaneth Me. I am happy today and the sun shines bright. The clouds have been rolled away. For the Savior said, whosoever will may come with him to stay. Whosoever surely meaneth me, surely meaneth me, oh surely meaneth me. Whosoever surely meaneth me, whosoever meaneth me. All my hopes have been raised, oh his name be praised. His glory has filled my soul. I've been lifted up and from sin set free. His blood has made me whole. Whosoever surely meaneth me, surely meaneth me, oh surely meaneth me. Whosoever surely meaneth me, whosoever meaneth me. Oh, what wonderful love, oh, what grace divine, that Jesus should die for me. I was lost in sin, for the world I find, but now I am set free. Whosoever surely meaneth me, surely meaneth me, oh surely meaneth me. Whosoever surely meaneth me, whosoever meaneth me.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for this evening that we can get together. We can study your word. We can fellowship with one another. We ask that you help us to never take this for granted and to always be excited to have a fire lit within us to just get together around anything centered around your word and your name. We ask that you help us whenever it is time for us to leave tonight, that we take your word with us, that we take your love with us out into the world and everywhere we go and with everyone we meet. Help us to be a bright, shining light to your world, Lord. We ask these things in your Son's holy name. Amen. All right. All right, before we dismiss to our classes tonight, I wanted to talk for just a minute. We're going to be digging into Esther a little bit more later. Uh, but Esther is the story of an exiled Jewish orphan who was raised by her cousin and who became queen of Persia. And she would go on to rescue the entire Jewish race from genocide. But I want us to consider two ideas from this book. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther, but he is seen throughout. We see God enacting his plans throughout the entire book. Can God be seen in our lives in the same way? Or do we have to tell people who it is that we follow, who it is that we worship? Does our life look any different from a non-believer? Or do we have to declare to them who it is that we worship? Would they assume that we worship any other God if we don't say otherwise? If they just looked at our life, would they see anything else that we put before God? We must allow God to be visible in all that we do. Another point is Esther is given the opportunity to do several big things in her life. And life can drop us in many different places that we would not choose to be in were it up to us. But given those opportunities to do big things, she was also given opportunities to deny those things. However, she asks herself, how does this fit God's plan? We must consider, perhaps I'm in this position I'm in this place that I'm in, and in this time that I'm in for this purpose. And what good can I do while I'm here? Tonight, if you need encouragement, if you need prayers, or if you just need to rekindle that fire that you have for God, to remember that no matter where you are in life or what you're doing, that you can find a way to live out God's purpose in your life. If that's something that you're in need of tonight, then please come as we stand and sing.
Heal at the cross, Christ will meet you there. The intercedes for you. Lift up your voice, plead with him your care, and meet him high anew. Heal at the cross,
All right, so tonight we are going to do a little look at the book of Esther. And so before we really dig in, just want to try to set the stage for where we're at in history. So around 480 BC, there's a massive Persian army marching to face the rebel forces of Athens and its Greek allies. Xerxes gets together an army of around 250,000 men to get revenge on Greece for the battles that they lost against his father, King Darius, in King Darius' lifetime. So Xerxes is planning to avenge his father. His armies reach Athens, but the Greeks drive them back out. But there's all this animosity and fighting going on between Persia, the current great empire, and Greece, the would-be next great empire, until eventually Alexander the Great comes along and defeats the Persian Empire for good. But this Xerxes from history that you've probably seen in a number of different stories and battles, this is the king that we see here in the book of Esther. He's the son of Darius and the grandson of Cyrus the Great, the Persian ruler that decreed that the Jews could go back to their homeland in Israel, where they rebuild the city of Jerusalem after 70 years of captivity. However, not all the Jews went home. Some chose to stay. So that's just a little bit of a background of what's going on right now, but who are we going to mainly be talking about from the book of Esther? So we have King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes. We have Esther, who is a Jewish exiled orphan who's raised by her cousin. We have her cousin that raised her, Mordecai. And we have Haman. Now, Haman hated Mordecai. And Haman was an Agagite. So, which is an important detail. That's part of the origin for Haman's hatred of Mordecai and the Jews. So if we go back almost 1,000 years to the Exodus from Egypt, the Jews are attacked by the Amalekites. And God curses the Amalekites for this, that one day they will be extinct. And 4 centuries later, King Saul conquers the Amalekites. Saul captures their king, Agag, and Saul was instructed to kill him, but he actually let him live. And that is one of a few things that Saul does to displease God and leads to him losing his throne. But eventually the prophet Samuel did kill King Agag. In fact, we're told that he hacked him to pieces. Haman was an Agagite, and Haman knew his family's history, and he knew that it was a Jewish prophet by the name of Samuel who had killed his royal ancestor. And Mordecai was also a descendant of Saul. So there's a lot of family feud history going on between these two families that will just be exaggerated more even later in this story. But if we begin in chapter 1, we've talked a little bit about the battles that are going on between Persia and Greece. In chapter 1 of Esther, Persia is planning to conquer Greece. And they host a 6-month war summit, a 6-month war planning strategy meeting on how they're going to accomplish this. And at the end of the 6 months, they celebrate what they believe are going to be their plans they've developed that will lead them to victory. They celebrate with a 7-day banquet feast. And so they're all feeling really good about themselves. 7 days of extravagance, of food and of wine, just the works. This is a not like the birthday parties we throw, let's just say that. But on the 7th day of this banquet feast, the king orders his queen, Queen Vashti, to come down and join the party. And basically, he wants to show off her beauty to everyone who's in attendance. He wants to flaunt her. And Queen Vashti refuses to come. So this presents kind of a problem for the king. First of all, he's the leader of their entire empire. What he says goes. And if he can tell his wife, "Hey, come join the party," and she says no, if she can refuse her husband's request, not only her husband but the king's request, then the other wives can disobey their husbands as well. So the men of the day got together and thought, this isn't a good thing. So they get together, they demote Vashti from being queen because she disobeyed, and they didn't want the other wives behaving likewise. And then we see in chapter 2, around 2 years has passed, and so far Persia's conquest of Greece has been unsuccessful. So finally, the king decides to move forward with the selection of Queen Vashti's replacement. And he calls for an empire-wide beauty contest, essentially. All the women would be brought forth, and they'd be put in front of the king. He would decide, if he thinks that they're attractive, if they appeal to him. It's like an episode of The Bachelor, really, but on a massive, massive scale. And finally, he would dwindle down, and he would choose one. Well, Esther stood out to him among all the other women. She continued to have 12 months of beautification and pampering, and we're told that the king loved Esther more than all the other women. And we've touched on this before, but Esther was raised by her cousin Mordecai. They were Jewish, and Mordecai advised her to keep this a secret. So in chapter 2, starting in verse 21, if you're following along in your Bible with me, in those days, as Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on the king. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. When the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on the gallows, and it was recorded in the book of Chronicles in the presence of the king. So we see that Vashti's replacement has been found. It happens to be Queen Esther, who is secretly a Jew. She's keeping this a secret. Of all the people in this entire nation, Jewish and non-Jewish, she happens to be the one here that catches the king's eye. He loves her more than all the rest. He chooses her, this Cinderella story of this once orphan, exiled woman who becomes queen. And then her cousin who raised her, he's sticking around kind of close by, still trying to watch out for her. He overhears a plot that the king would be murdered. He makes sure he lets his cousin know, and they're able to foil the plot to have the king killed. That's chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, we learn a little bit more about Haman. So Haman has been promoted to second in command. The only person above him is the king. And all of the king's servants bowed down and paid homage to him, except for Mordecai. And Haman sought to destroy Mordecai over this. And not just Mordecai, but all the Jews. If he were to destroy just this one, the rest of the Jewish people could rise up against him. So he's trying to devise a plan. We're just going to wipe them all out, because this man did not bow to me. Second in command, not even first in command. Haman casts or lots. We've heard the term casting lots. But he cast lots to determine what would be the best time for me to annihilate the Jewish people. What would be the best time for me to kill Mordecai? Then he approaches the king and convinces him that these Jews are a threat. This is a problem. They've got their own lands. They've got their own customs. They're a threat to your kingdom. They have their own laws, and we've got to get rid of them. And the king goes along with it. This king is obviously a very powerful man. He's got a bit of a temper, but he's very impressionable. We're going to see throughout the book, under the right circumstances, he'll go with what someone would like him to do. But Mordecai, again, this is something else he hears about. He hears about Haman's plan. He learned of this message, and he shares it with Esther. And he lets her know, you need to use your influence to make sure that this doesn't come to pass. And in chapter 4, starting in verse 10, we'll read for a little bit here. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes into the king's inner court without being called there, there is but one law to be put to death, except for the one whom the king holds out his golden scepter that he might live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king for these 30 days. And they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them, reply to Esther, do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather the Jews found in Susa and hold fast on my behalf. Do not eat or drink for 3 days or nights, and I and my young women will fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai finds out about this plot, and luckily his cousin just so happens to be queen. So they're both Jews. So he tells her, we're Jews, you're queen. What can you do about this? She says, if I go to the king without being called, he could put me to death. But Mordecai tells her, you're in danger of being put to death anyway. So your life's about to be forfeited no matter what you do. But God's going to find a way to save us. It just is a matter of whether or not you're going to let him use you for that task. So she reluctantly agrees. But this is something else I also thought was interesting. Again, this is an example. We haven't heard God mentioned yet, but Esther's talking about fasting. And fasting didn't happen without prayer. So they're talking about praying and fasting. And who do the Jewish people pray to? God. So we see his fingerprints throughout this story. And in chapter 5, we see that the king does in fact extend his scepter, meaning he's not going to choose to kill Queen Esther for coming in and breaking the law, but coming in before him without being called. So in chapter 5, we'll start reading in verse 2, maybe go on for a little while. And the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, and she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, what is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you unto half of my kingdom. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king. Then the king said, bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked. So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, what is it you wish? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even unto half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled. Then Esther answered, my wish and my request is this. If I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I'll do as the king said. So Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. And he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches and the number of his sons and all the promotions for which the king had honored him. And now he had been advanced above all the officials and the servants of the king. And then Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast that she prepared. and tomorrow I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully to the king to the feast." And this idea pleased Haman, and the gallows were made. So we see Mordecai warning Esther of this, and her reluctantly accepting to go before the king and see what she can do to maybe prevent this from happening. And she goes before the king, and he says, "What do you want? I'll give it to you. Just name it." And so, for starters, she wants to go to a banquet with him. She'll cook for him, have him over, but she wants the man in question, Haman, to attend this as well with her. So I can't help but think about in my mind, you ever been to an awkward dinner and it just seems like it lasts forever? How long were they sitting at the table together eating, and what were they talking about leading up to this? And it says when they were done eating and they had drank wine. So just this whole time, this must have been weighing on Esther's heart, and she's just playing it cool best she can. And I just can't just imagine what that was like. But eventually the king says, "Okay, spill it. What is it? What do you want?" Again, you can have it. You just name it. And for some reason she thinks better, and she says, "Well, let's do this again one more night." I don't know, maybe she wanted to pray about it some more. Who knows her reasoning for doing that, but she says, "Let's do this again tomorrow." Haman's feeling great about himself. "I've been called to a banquet with just me and the king and the queen, nobody else, just us three." He must be feeling really good about himself, so much so that he can't wait to go home and tell his family all about all the promotions, all his riches, all of the good things happening in his life. And half of what he's about to be bragging to them about, he doesn't even know the plans that are being made against him. But on his way home, he sees Mordecai again, and he just can't stand it. Even though he's wrong about so many of the good things happening in his life, he's mistaken about those, but he believes those are good things happening. He's still going to let this man weigh down on him and ruin what he believes are other good things happening for him. He just had such a hatred for this man and his disloyalty not to bow down to him. And his family advises him, "You know what? Mordecai's got to go. He's ruining your happiness. You've got all these good things going for you. And, if you get rid of him, things are really looking up." He thinks that's a good idea. So now we're in chapter 6, and all this has transpired so far. The king's had this feast with his number 2 guy and his queen, but for some reason he just can't sleep this night. Even after his belly's been full, even after he's had a lot to drink, the king can't sleep. And so he orders for the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, to be brought to him. Again, this is one of those times where we're seeing God kind of pulling the strings here. But of all the books, this book, and of all the places in that book to turn to, we see that he winds up turning to where Mordecai's name was put into this book for having turned over the information that saved the king's life. And he asks his attendants in the room, "What honor has been given Mordecai for doing this?" And they say he's not been rewarded yet. And that's just another spot in this book where everything could have changed. What if he would have been rewarded immediately after he had saved the king's life? The king wouldn't owe him a debt at this time. So he was forgotten about initially for this very moment. This was almost 5 years earlier. It had been almost 5 years since Mordecai had saved his life. So they say he's not been rewarded yet. And the king says, "Well, who's in the court?" This is in verse 4. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak with the king. Remember, he's feeling good about himself. He's about ready to kill Mordecai. But he's to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Well, let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And so Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on one whose head a royal crown is set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Then the king said to Haman, anticipation's filling with him right now, "Hurry, take the robes and the horse, and do as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew." Just like the wind sucked out of Haman. "To Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man who the king delights to honor." That's wild right there. Of all the men in the whole kingdom, he hates this man so much that he not only wants to kill him, but he wants to kill the entire Jewish race. And he's feeling so good about himself in front of the king, and what a 180. He thinks all this is about to happen to him, the best things that he could think for himself. And instead, in a split second, it goes to his worst enemy, the one that he had actually walked in the room hoping to walk out with permission to murder this man. And then in verse 12, "Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman hurried to his house, mourning with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends that had happened to him." So he's already had this conversation with them earlier about all the good things that are happening, and not much time has passed, and things have started to change for him. But he told them all that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but will surely fall before him." And while they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. So he's in the middle of all this, and he gets interrupted abruptly. "Hey, it's time to go to your other party." So it's just one thing after another, ups and downs, and is this good? Is this bad? He's going through an emotional roller coaster right now. Then we see in chapter 7, starting in verse 7. "So the king and Haman went into the feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, 'What is it you wish, Queen? It shall be granted to you. And what is your request? Even to half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled.' Then Esther answered, 'If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and to be killed and to be annihilated. If we were sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king.' Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, 'Who is he and where is he who dared to do this?' And Esther said, 'A foe, an enemy, this wicked man.' Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen." So the king finally gets it out of her. "What is it you would like?" You can tell she's been trained over the last several years, and even before being selected as queen, how to talk to the king. She says, if we were just going to be slaves, I wouldn't have said anything. For our suffering is nothing to that which the king suffers. But she's working him up, and then he's furious. Who is it who's doing what you're accusing them of doing? She says, "It's this guy sitting right here next to us eating dinner." And it says Haman was terrified. Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And in verse 7, the king arose in his wrath from the wine and drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed back to beg for his life from Queen Esther. for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. The king steps away for a minute, and Haman's just begging Queen Esther, please spare my life. Well, when the king comes back, it says, and the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the words left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing out at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king was abated. So he's good now. But all of this happening for Haman, he's been a complete 180. He was the king's number 2. Banquets with just he and the queen herself, plotting to kill his worst enemy. Things are going to go well. And just like that, he's been murdered on the very gallows that he had planned to use to murder someone else. But this didn't do anything to fix the laws that were already put in place by the king and Haman to make sure that the Jews could be eradicated. But in chapter 8, the king gives all that belonged to Haman over to Esther and Mordecai. He makes Mordecai second in command. And the unique thing about the Persian law, they had what they called the law of the Medes and Persians. And in Daniel chapter 6, verse 12, we see this mentioned. It says, then they came near and said before the king concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to do to any god or man within 30 days except for you, O king, shall be cast into the lion's den? And the king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which cannot be revoked. So we see that as an example from that book where once something was written into law under the Persian law, it couldn't be unwritten. It was there. It was there to stay. In chapter 8, starting in verse 3, then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out his golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, if it please the king, if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite and the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who were in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see this calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then the king Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he intended to lay hands on the Jew. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring. For an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. In verse 10, and he wrote in the name of the king Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in the city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed forces of people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province, in every city where the king's command and edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, and a feasting and holiday. And many of the people of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. I'd never noticed that part before, and I thought that was really interesting. These people a law had been written that they could wipe out the Jews, and there were likely many people planning to take part in that. And all of a sudden, with these changes being made, now there are people who weren't Jews at all claiming, "Hey, I'm with these guys. I'm a Jew." And isn't that so much so how God's people are as well? People, there are times when maybe we don't want to own up to being Christian or being a follower of God, and people who certainly don't now and may never, but there will come a time where we're going to want to say, "Hey, maybe I wasn't always with them, but I want to be with those guys." But anyway, the Jews destroyed their enemies. The Jews defended their lives and killed 75,000 of their enemies and did not plunder, which was a part of the law they made when they took the king's ring, and they wrote the law however they wanted to, and they stamped it on there. One of the things they wrote, they were allowed to plunder, but it says the Jews did not plunder. And the feast of Purim was inaugurated. The day of the Jews got relief from their enemies is still celebrated today between March 6th and 7th. And I had to put that date on there because I celebrate that as well. Not because I'm Jewish, because the 7th is my birthday. But what are some summary lessons from that we see this book? This book it's kind of an easier story to follow. It's just a story. We don't see a whole lot of genealogies in it. We don't see a whole lot of complicated things to understand. And it really is built like the way we consume a lot of our stories these days, whether fairy tale stories, and underdogs rise to power and they overcome. It's structured much how we're trained to follow stories. But one is absolutely the providence of God. We see God pulling the strings and acting anonymously in this story all over it. And God's will be done. Not everything that we see in this story is God's will, but God's will be done. For example, if we look at some other instances where that's true, we look at Pharaoh being asked to let these people be free. And he could have listened to Moses and God's people would have been let go. But he didn't listen and God's people got let go. The only difference that was made in his decision was his own soul. And we see in the same thing with the life of Joseph. And his brothers sell him into slavery. And he goes through a lot of hardship and winds up being promoted second in command. And winds up, through his actions, many people are saved. And he says, "You meant it to me for evil, but God meant it for good." And what about when Mordecai tells Esther? He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from some other place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come into this kingdom for such a time as this?" And we must always keep in mind God's promises to us. And because for one, we know that God's promised the Messiah is going to come through this line of people. So if God's going to keep that promise, these people are going to survive. And whether that's exactly what Mordecai was referring to, I'm not sure. But God had no intention for these people to perish. And Mordecai was wise to instruct her so, because he was going to take care of his people. And she just chose the right side. She chose to be on that winning team. And we look at so many different areas of this book where you got to ask yourself, is this coincidence or is it providence? And we know the answer, but it's wild to look at. So if we look at so many things that could have gone differently, but Mordecai, chooses not to bow down to somebody who's not his God. Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman. If that goes differently, the whole story goes differently. But he wouldn't bow. Then he happens to overhear a plot for the king to be murdered. And these people are plotting against the king. They're probably doing their best to keep it pretty hush-hush. But Mordecai happens to get wind of this. And so he makes sure the king knows about it, and the king's saved. Well, because of this, his name gets documented into the book of memorable deeds. Then along with this, out of all of the women, well, we could go back to even to Vashti. If Vashti decides to join the party, she doesn't get replaced, but she doesn't join the party. And then the king could have chose any number of women, and he winds up choosing Esther. He loved her not only enough to make her queen, but to spare her life when she breaks the law, coming straight into his chambers without being called. Then the king just so happens to can't sleep. And he decides, well, what's the good solution for that? I'll read a book. And of all the books, I'll choose that book. And of all the areas in that book, I'll turn to that page where Mordecai happens to be. He happens to not have been rewarded from years earlier. Well, who's in the court that can advise me on this? Well, here comes Haman. Perfect timing. What should be done to this man? Well, he gets an earful there, and such is done. And then we see Haman hung on the very gallows that he had intended for Mordecai. Mordecai is made second in command, leading to additional fear from those that might attack the Jews and wipe them out, because now, well, we were going to kill these people, but now they've passed a law they can defend themselves. And not only that, but the number 2 man in the empire is a Jew. Maybe we should second guess this a little bit. But another thought for the lesson, getting close to wrapping up here, but sometimes the most noble and righteous causes require sacrifice. And we see that with Queen Esther. She knew she was going to break the law and be putting her life at risk by going before the king. And she had it pretty good. So even if he chose not to murder her, he could have demoted her, and her life goes back to being vastly different. But she says, get with your people, pray and fast for me, and I'll go to the king. And if I perish, I perish. And if I perish, I perish. Like I've never been faced with a situation like that. It might feel like that sometimes, but being willing to sacrifice for Christ in anything, to the extreme of losing our life, but even picking up our cross daily for Christ. We also see the evils of racial hatred. Sometimes that's something that it seems so silly that you don't even think about it, because what an absurd reason to feel hatred or to feel animosity toward another human being because of their race or where they're from or their culture. But we see it to the extreme with Haman, so much so that he had festered this hatred for this one man that led to a hatred for an entire race of people. And he passed a law that they were at serious jeopardy, were it not for God, of facing genocide. And God saves him, and that hatred cost Haman his life. Had he not felt that, had he not gone after the Jews like that, he would have been spared. And then lastly, we see just time after time again in the Bible, as a whole, or whether you break it up and look at it book by book, we see just a recurring theme that the wicked will ultimately fail, and ultimately the righteous will be rewarded. And there's a lot of times where we see injustice, and we see suffering, we see things that we just don't think are right, we can't explain, or again, we're put in positions that we have to ask ourselves, why am I in this place, in this time, in this position? But we have to trust God and know that no matter where we're at in our story, even if we can't see it, God's pulling the strings. His providence is guiding us. If we trust Him, we love Him. And ultimately, whether it's in this life or the next, righteousness will be rewarded. That's all that I've got for tonight. We've got a few minutes left, but you're dismissed, or if you'd like to fellowship, that's all right as well. Thank you.